Hello and welcome to Mobile Games What Happens Next. This is a talk given at the Nordic Game conference on the 17th of May 2017. My name is Jon Jordan. I've been writing about computer games for over 15 years, been writing about mobile games for 15 years or so. Written for various different publications and websites during that time. I was also a co-founder at a company called Still Media, which was behind the Pocket Gamer websites and conferences. I was also editor of PocketGamer.biz, which is the B2B website, for a number of years as well. So I'm coming at this from a very business-oriented angle. I left Still Media after 10 years in September 2016, so I've taken some time off and since then been looking around to see what I want to do. So doing some writing still, doing some consultancy in terms of business development and game consultancy, also speaking at conferences like Nordic Game, bit of stuff on YouTube. I do a lot on free-to-play mobile games at the Longview, so you can see the Twitter handle there, and a copy of the slides also available via that link. So also quite interested in art, so during this talk I'm going to do a bit of art education, art history, and to start off with, when thinking about where are mobile games going, the future of mobile games, this kind of picture came to mind. So this is Paul Gauguin. Where do we come from? What are we? Where are we going? So this is post-impressionist kind of masterpiece, the kind of cycle of life. So I think before we can understand where mobile games are going, we need to look at where they come from and what they are doing at the moment to provide that kind of context. So where do we come from? So for some people, mobile games began on the 10th of July 2008 when the Apple App Store launched. The Apple App Store was clearly a very significant point in the history of mobile games and the development of the industry, but mobile games did exist before the App Store, certain type of mobile game maybe. So at the top there we have Snake, 1997, embedded on Nokia devices. The simplest graphics you can have, but actually well adapted to the control system you had in terms of phones at the time, and you had a high score, which is really all you needed. You had kind of the gameplay and a high score, and people got lots of enjoyment from that kind of game. It wasn't just those type of games happening in the early days of mobile gaming. So beneath that you have Alien Fish Exchange, which is not so well known, but kind of one of the first examples of a mobile internet game. So use the WAP technology at the time, so a client server game. You ran the kind of a client on your phone and did bred and nurtured fish, and then you kind of sold them and it kind of talked to the server. Ahead of its time, clearly. And even before the App Store was happening, there were quite a lot of kind of serious companies being set up, some of which have continued to the present day. So I guess most famously we have Rovio, set up in 2003, not set up as Rovio, it changed its name a bit later. Same thing with Gameville, the South Korean publisher, set up year 2000. And a few others who kind of still with us, if not necessarily thriving. So Glue Mobile, set up and floated on the Nasdaq exchange before the App Store went live. Gameloft as well, quite successful at certain periods of time, but since has been bought by Vivendi Games. Excuse me. And also we have a number of kind of smaller developers who have been going for over 15 years making mobile games. Another interesting thing to point out, some of these companies are really going from strength to strength now. So Rovio has had its best year ever for mobile games revenue. Same thing for Gameville. So some of these companies that started out in the early days are doing really well now. So who are the kind of the people kind of setting up these companies and running these companies? Whatever happened to them, kind of thing. So here's some of the faces of the time. So on the far left you have Nicholas Head, who's a co-founder at Rovio, still working with Rovio. Tommy Palm set up Jadestone, then became the kind of later on the face of Candy Crush with King, now doing VR gaming. In the middle, Ilkka Bakkanen, now CEO of Supercell, but back in the day had co-founded a company called Sumera in Finland. Was bought by a bigger American publisher, Digital Chocolate, very strong at the time. Next to Ilkka we have Mitch Lasky, a well-known VC venture capitalist at Benchmark Capital. He's invested in companies like Riot Games, League of Legends developer, and Natural Motion. But back in the day, he was CEO of a company called Jamdat, and they were the big US mobile game publisher floated on the Nasdaq. And finally, at far right, we have Oliver Meow. Back in the day, he was with Vivendi Mobile. Vivendi, as we said, kind of were actually big in mobile back then. They've come back more recently buying Gameloft. But Oliver now is CEO of a company called Pixelberry, and they have a successful game called Choices, currently in the top 30 games in the US App Store. And that's kind of part of a new wave of games, which are more like interactive narrative games. So something about how the genres have changed during that time. But a lot of the games we kind of play and a lot of the kind of genres that have been successful were being experimented with, back in the day. So we have Social Casino on the far left there with Downtown Texas Hold'em. Social Casino generally underrated the kind of importance of that kind of segment of the mobile games industry. A bit different to the other games, granted, but very significant and was from the early days. Obviously, we have licensed games all the time. Star Wars there, Star Wars Force Unleashed. Celebrity games have done well and not done so well over the period, but this is Brittany. Not Brittany. This is Paris Hilton's Diamond Quest. Gameloft game from 2006. Obviously, Match 3 is something that has really thrived in the mobile game space just because it fits so well onto the kind of form factor. Has very kind of simple controls that can work well in lots of different kind of form factors. That's Bejeweled. And then strategy games. There's Townsmen 4 from Handy Games back in the day. So all those kind of key genres. Obviously, there's been some new ones as well, but some of those key ones that have always been with us, started out back in the day. But there was a big issue, clearly, why people think the App Store was so important, because you didn't really have a kind of a well-defined growing industry at that time in terms of consumer revenue. Partly because distribution was very broken; it was kind of siloed into kind of carrier decks. A lot of the handsets were incompatible with each other, and obviously not designed for playing mobile games, designed for talking and texting a little bit. And you also have this kind of form factor was kind of more generally. There was like a conceptual problem about it. So when Nokia, who were the top manufacturer at the time, were thinking about, well, how can we make a game, how can we make a phone that's good for playing mobile games? They came up with this kind of very odd N-Gage, which clearly wasn't good for making phone calls, as this kind of taco meme spread around the internet shows. But equally, it wasn't very good for playing games. So you kind of had this kind of odd situation where pretty much everything was broken. And, the mobile games industry existed, in spite, despite all the problems. A bit like kind of VR now, maybe not make that point too much, but lots of problems. So where were we? Back to a bit of art. So this is Peter Bruegel, the Elder, and his the fight between Carnival and Lent. Okay, so what happened? The App Store launched something that Steve Jobs called the Grand Slam. It's kind of funny looking back at the press releases at the time. So a week after the App Store launched, Apple was boasting of 10 million downloads, of having 800 apps, of which 90% were cost less than $10. It's a very different era from where we are now, even when the App Store launched. All about paid content, really. A bit of art there. So the creation of Adam by Michelangelo on the Sistine Chapel. Something had been created of significance at this point, although we didn't necessarily exactly know the App Store was going to be dominated by games. But there were quite early on, a lot of creativity, a lot of reinvention of what mobile games were about. So suddenly you have different levels of quality of graphics, certainly. More importantly, different types of gameplay were enabled by touchscreen devices. So in the top left there we have flight control. So a line drawing game. You had lots of line drawing games where you're drawing tracks with your finger on the touchscreen. We have kind of tappy games beneath that. So we have Doodle Jump, kind of a bit. It's a bit like Snake, kind of primitive graphics and simple gameplay, tapping and tilting with a high score, and the high score was what drove people to play that game. Next to that, we have Tap Tap Revenge, a music-based rhythm action game. Then we have two games that are kind of about kind of cutting things. So I've Cut the Rope at the top, so a puzzle-based game, and then Fruit Ninja, where you're kind of cutting fruit. Angry Birds down the bottom obviously was one of the real kind of big games at that time. Bejeweled's still there, so there's the match 3 doesn't go away. Above that we have Field Runners, so tower defense was absolutely enormous at that time. Field Runners 1 and 2, came out, did very well, and then we have these kind of even these more experimental games. So we have Pocket God in the middle there, and that was, you know, kind of an interactive kind of simulator type thing. It was kind of said to, to a bit tongue-in-cheek maybe to be like a torture simulator for teenage boys. You have these kind of little pygmies on a desert island. You can feed them to the sharks and get them struck by lightning and that kind of stuff. But there was a lot of different stuff going on, a lot of experimentation. And remember, these were all paid games, so these were all games that sold millions of units. So there's, you know, we started to have a proper industry where consumer revenue is being measured in tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in the end. But it didn't last really. These are the guys who were making the games, and they're kind of creatives at this point. They're not really businessmen in the broadest sense of the word, and some of them at least were not really looking to build businesses. So on the far left we have Rob Murray, who was set up Firemint, an Australian developer, did real racing and flight control, and they were kind of actually a proper company. Got bought by EA, and then Rob's not in the industry anymore. So he kind of moved on. Next to that, we have Bart de Creme, who set up Tapulous, did Tap Tap Revenge, got bought by Disney. He then ran Disney's mobile business for a while, then left the industry. And obviously, Disney's pulled out of games since then. Nicholas Head from Revio still at the bottom there. Interestingly, next to him, we have the Vomanoff brothers, who set up the Zepto Lab, did Cut the Rope, very successful. And they have built a very kind of strong company in the interim. Trying lots of different things out. So it's not the case that no one kind of has continued in the industry, but a lot of the people who were involved for a short period of time, and when the business changed, they didn't change with it. So we have next to that we have Igor with his brother, who set up Lima Sky and did Doodle Jump. I mean, Igor almost like an artist, really. Wouldn't really say he's a game developer. And Doodle Jump was his thing, the doodler. He did, done IP deals. He was interested in kind of extending that IP, but didn't really want to make any other games. And similarly, next to them we have Dave and Alan from Bolt Creative, who made the Pocket God series, and they did kind of different games based on Pocket God IP, but didn't really want to branch out into anything else. Didn't want to create a company, and so kind of had their time in the spotlight, and then the spotlight moved elsewhere. Why did that happen? Well, because we're talking about paid games at this point, and it becomes very hard to market those games. So we had at the time what was called the rush to 99 cents. So this pie chart is created about a year after the App Store goes live, and it's a pie chart of the top 100 games on the App Store and what their pricing was. So already 49% of the games are the cheapest price you could have at that time, 99 cents. Over 3/4 are less than $3, and part of the reason this was happening was people were using pricing as a marketing tool. So a game might launch at 99 cents, and the developer might say in 2 weeks I'm going to put it up to $3.99 to try and drive sales in a quick period of time. You also had this kind of free app a day type idea where people would maybe dropping the price to zero for a couple of days, getting lots of downloads, then hoping kind of word of mouth as a marketing tool would work as they put the price back up. And there was lots of kind of like limited time sales or kind of Black Friday sales, this kind of stuff. This proved unsustainable because kind of everyone was doing it, so 99 cents kind of became an accepted price to release a game at, and that just weren't enough people with iPhones at the time to make that a viable business. So a big change did happen. Happened with iOS 3.0 when Apple allowed microtransactions in-app purchases to happen. Originally just for paid games and then for free games. So you had this kind of idea of freemium games or free-to-play games, as it kind of came to be known. And this was a big shock in lots of ways. So one of the time it was a big shock was when Capcom released its game Smurfs Village. So Smurfs Village came out of nowhere and did extremely well. But there was a bit of a backlash because some parents had given their iPhones to their kids, and their kids had been tapping away buying these Smurf Bros, and suddenly they had a bill for thousands of dollars. So partly this was just because people didn't really understand what free-to-play games were and how the business model worked. Developers didn't understand it. Apple didn't really understand it either. So Apple had to change its the way you logged in using your password when you bought in-app purchases, rather than kind of buying apps or buying downloads, or you could set things up. But there were obviously safeguards you could put in to stop your device being used to buy in-app purchases. So everyone kind of understood it and kind of got through this kind of shocking period. I mean, some people still think spending $100 in a free-to-play mobile game for in-app currencies is a abomination. But most people have moved on. there was a kind of interesting backlash. So um, this little graphic is from the South Park had a pop at free to play games, and it's kind of interesting. Partly because I think things have moved on a little bit, but the argument was these games are not really very much fun at all. But the developers somehow think if you pay, they'll become more fun. But actually, if you think about how kind of consumerism works, which is linked to kind of psychology and other things, often we spend money for physical objects, but often we spend money for experiences. And by spending money, we actually do find those experiences sometimes more enjoyable. So it's actually not incorrect. This kind of like flow of fun is not incorrect, and actually is a positive thing. If you spend $100 buying Smurf brews and you don't get $100 of fun out of it, you don't do it again. So to have a sustainable industry, people who are spending money in these games are obviously having more fun. I guess the argument now would be: are these games just barely fun without paying anything, or do you have to pay to make them fun? I'm very much of the opinion that these games can be fun without having any in-app purchases. I don't really do in-app purchases, but play lots of games. And more generally, free-to-play totally changed mobile games. For me, free-to-play changed mobile games more than the App Store. The App Store needed to be there to kind of provide the distribution and the billing. But free-to-play as a kind of business model, as a way of approaching the business side of things, totally changed the games and totally changed the industry and the kind of people who are involved and the companies that are involved. So we weren't looking at gameplay anymore. We were looking at meta games, so it's kind of leveling up of characters and things, and giving much more kind of think about retention of people playing games for months and years. You have this kind of whole idea, user acquisition, a kind of complex marketing structure. You're not looking at sales or downloads now. You're looking at games as a service, always available, and daily active users, players, and really thinking about players and payers and how they interact. So this is really the kind of the start of the modern mobile games industry for me, and that's really kind of showing us where we're going, the start of where we're going. Lots of new genres appeared. You can see there's lots of green here, so suddenly we have these kind of farming games coming in to mobile. These games all released in 2010. So we have We Rule in the top left, we have Smurfs Village beneath that, we have Tap Zoo, Pocket Gems under that, Zombie Farm. Have some nurturing style games, so Dragon's Veil, very big, where you're nurturing and breeding dragons. But that's a similar kind of approach, but this time Frogs, Pocket Frogs. Interestingly, that's the only game in portrait mode. So a lot of this point, iPads coming in. People are talking a lot more about tablet gaming. Will tablet gaming be its own kind of subsector of mobile gaming? Will it be bigger than mobile gaming? Some people thinking, we can put more hardcore games in there. So this is the shooter game is Eliminate from MG Moko. Shooter games have never been very successful in the West. Certainly as free-to-play games, but people were trying this kind of stuff. And so we see with every kind of new disruption, a new set of people. So we have, I mean, there were still some creatives, but most of these guys now were much more entrepreneurs, really. So on the far left, we have Ben Yu from Pocket Gems. Ben's still with Pocket Gems. Talk a bit about them later. We have so we still have some creatives who kind of wanted to do it for its own sake. So we have the Marsh twins there, the Nimblebit. That's what they're called, the developer Nimblebit, and they did Pocket Frogs and Tiny Tower and lots of other very kind of indie focused, kind of almost auteur games where all the graphics were very pixelated, and they just did what they wanted to do. They didn't build a massive company or anything. Beneath them we have Niccolo De Masi, who's the CEO of Glue Mobile. As said, they're still a Nasdaq floated company, and he was very aggressive when free to play came along that he was going to change the entire company to do free to play games, and absolutely did that. We'll talk a bit about Glue as well later. So next to them we have Neil Young. So Neil Young was an executive at EA, Electronic Arts, saw the iPhone, set up a company called NG Moko to make games for iPhone. Had some success with paid games, but when free-to-play came in, really saw the opportunity, went very aggressively into free-to-play games, built a big studio, built a publishing business, built a tech build business, and then quickly sold that on. He's actually now back in the industry, so he's got a new company called Network, and they're doing kind of mid-core. They've got one game out of mid-core. Match 3 games, I was saying Match 3 can be used in lots of different ways. That game's called Legendary. And then on the far right we have Julian Farrier. So he set up a company called Backflip. Again, like NG Moko, they were fairly successful in the paid era. So they had a game called Paper Toss, very casual games. They did a lot of kind of free ad funded games. But when free play came along, Dragon Veil was their big hit, got in quickly, very successful, and he built kind of quite a substantial company with Backflip, and since got bought out by Hasbro, and he's still in the industry, and Backflip is still making games. So where are we on the art front? Maybe a bit of cubism. So this is Picasso. This is Les Demoiselles d'Avion. We can see, we can see there's some familiar form here. We can see kind of it's harking back to kind of classical paintings, but something very different has changed as well in terms of the kind of like the faces, and disturbing maybe for some people, but certainly something has changed. So getting on to point 2, what are we? This is Kate Upton from Game of War's Super Bowl ad a couple of years ago. Who would have thought mobile gaming was running TV ads during the most expensive slot in US schedules, the Super Bowl, but that's what we got to. And the reason that is mobile games are now big business. I mean, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. This is figures from Newzoo, the market intelligence company, just came out a couple of weeks ago, and it shows gross App Store revenue. So in blue we have game revenue, in green we have the non-gaming revenue. We see games are dominating and will continue to do so. 2016 we have about $39 billion of game revenue. That's gross revenue, so that includes the 30% that Google and Apple take. 2017, the prediction is that rises to $46 billion, so quite a substantial rise. If you take the net amount of that, that's $37 billion of net revenue for developers to share. Where's this revenue being generated from? So this is Superdata, another market intelligence company who the figures don't always add up. They don't always agree. Superdata and Newzoo. Superdata in this case, they both agree about North America and Europe, which are easier to quantify. But Superdata has Asia much higher than Newzoo. That's partly because Asia is growing much quicker, so it's kind of harder to kind of estimate the value there. And the other thing to note, obviously in Asia we have China. China is the biggest mobile games market in the world as a single kind of entity. So it's about a quarter of the total game revenue comes from China, and in the APAC region, kind of shown in green there, we have over 50%, about 55% of all revenue comes from that region. Kind of Western markets is about 35%, a third, I suppose. But when it comes to growth, the growth is really happening in Asia. So while Europe and North America aren't kind of in decline, they're not growing particularly quickly. Asia is still growing quite quickly, and has kind of countries like Indonesia and India still to come on board. So that's why we're seeing this big kind of shift in the balance of power, and that's one of the big trends, I think, for the future. So let's have a look at the games that are making all this money. So nothing kind of surprising here, I suppose. This is an App Annie matrix of the top 5 top grossing games in various countries. So at the bottom we have China, South Korea and Japan, and then we have a kind of a bunch of Western countries, big markets. If we take out all the games that appear in at least appear in at least 2 countries, we kind of see this kind of trend emerging. So in the Western countries, a few games are appearing in lots of stores. So there's kind of that kind of market is fairly well integrated, and there's the same kind of cultural taste that games that do well in North America will do well in Europe. No surprise there, really. Just to point out, Australia's a bit interesting. So we've got 2 social casino games at number 1 and number 2. So we said before, social casino underrated in terms of its kind of revenue power, I think. France a little bit different as well, a bit more kind of cosmopolitan. Maybe it has 2 actually Asian developed games there. So number 2 is Dragon Ball Z, and number 5 is Summoner's Tales. So that's a Japanese game and a South Korean game, respectively. But if we look at APAC countries, no yellow at all. So the games that are doing well in China, South Korea, and Japan aren't doing well in any other territories. And it's even more kind of interesting than that, really. The games that are doing well in China are developed by Chinese companies. The games doing well in South Korea are developed by South Korean companies, and same thing in Japan. The companies that are doing this, to drill down again, so again, no surprises in terms of Supercell and MZ in the West really dominating. King has its positions as well. If you look at China, we have 2 games in the top 5 from NetEase. That's kind of the red comet. And NetEase is one of the 2 big Chinese mobile game companies. The other is Tencent. So interestingly, at the moment, Tencent only has 1 in the top 5. That's the number 1 though. So between them, Tencent and NetEase are by far and away the biggest games companies in China. They're the biggest PC games companies, and they're the biggest mobile games companies. And they have over 50% of the Chinese games market. I mean, there's really a duopoly there. It's very hard for other people to operate in the Chinese market, because you have these two very big companies who are releasing very popular games. Tencent has distribution muscle with WeChat and QQ and various other kind of platform plays. So they do publishing as well. So really quite hard, even though China is a big market, quite hard for new companies or even the established companies there that aren't Tencent and NetEase. A similar thing actually in South Korea. South Korea, we have three big companies. So we have NCSoft, Nexon, and Netmarble. So we have three games from Netmarble currently in the top 5 there. They're a little kind of a yellow monster. They've just IPO'd, floated on the stock exchange, raised $4 billion of revenue, looking to expand quite aggressively, particularly in the West. And they've already invested buying some assets from Caban, so they have some kind of US development. So again, in South Korea, you have these three companies, a triopoly maybe, very hard for anyone else to operate in that market. In Japan, don't have the similar thing, but you have just some very big games that have been very big games for a long period of time, so kind of act in a similar way. So particularly here we have at number 2, we have Mix's Monster Strike, and number 4, we have Puzzle and Dragons from Gung Ho, and those games have been in the charts. I mean, Puzzle and Dragons is 5 years old, and Monster Strike is getting on for 4 years. So these games have been just sitting in those top 5 positions. Number 1 actually at the moment is a newer game, but still a couple of years old now. So that is Fate Grand Order from Sony Music. Interesting that there are these big markets. There's big amounts of money involved, but for in terms of that, how much of that money is addressable for new companies or growth, it's quite difficult. You already have these big kind of players in these kind of markets already, kind of compressing everyone else. And we can see this in the US. So this is from Sensor Tower and Sega. So they produced a big report about the US market last year, and they, if you look in 2016, who was making who was generating the revenues. It's the people we've seen before, but now we kind of get an idea of the scale. So if you add up MZ, Supercell, and King, and then you throw in Social Casino, so that's Playtecha, part of Zynga, Big Fish, and Double Down, you've got 50% of the market there already taken by those kind of sectors. If you think that MZ and Supercell in particular are growing quite fast, you can see that the remaining other kind of players are getting squeezed. So the guys at the top are doing the best. Why is that? Winner takes all market. Again, no surprise, this is how app stores kind of work. So this is from the same report, and it looks at all the games released in 2016 and how much money they made in the US market. So we see at the top, Clash Royale, $277 million, Pokemon Go, $270 million. So $250 million those games are generating each in 2016. And then what's number 3? Lords Mobile generated $18 million. So you can see there's a massive gap there. So it's like basically a factor of kind of 1 to 10 ratio. And you have this winner takes all scenario. The other thing you have to think about, these other games that are doing $18 million doesn't sound terrible, but you have to think they're probably spending 30% of that on marketing, user acquisition, and then suddenly some of these games that look like they're doing quite good business may not actually be profitable for their companies, depending on how those companies operate. So this is kind of what happens in a maturing market. So who are the top dogs in this market? So again, it's a whole new set of faces with one notable exception. On the far left, we have Riccardo Zacconi, who's CEO of King. Not really necessarily a games guy so much as a professional CEO. Sold the company to Activision Blizzard. Next to him, we have the CEO of Gung Ho. So that's Kazuki Morishita. Get that right? Sorry, probably Japanese not very good. So he is a kind of actually a games guy, but kind of more of a product guy really. So he doesn't kind of develop games, but very kind of focused on the product. Very similar with Gabe Leiden. So he's the next one along. So he's the CEO and founder of MZ. And he's very kind of committed to this idea of kind of 24/7 gaming, 365 days a year, providing this kind of games as a service. With MZ being very successful, clearly. Ilkka Pakanen's back again, so we saw him in the early years, but now back with Supercell. Interestingly, during the period of paid games on the App Store, he wasn't involved, so he was doing Facebook games. Came back when free to play came in 2012. With the launch of some games. And then on the far right we have John Hankey. So he again is a product guy, not a games guy, and he actually was involved. He basically created Google Earth. Google bought his company, created Google Earth. He set up Niantic Labs within Google, and then they spun out as Niantic and did then Pokemon Go, which is a location-based game, obviously, and location is very much his thing. So these guys, they're not creatives in the same way we saw before. They're not entrepreneurs in the same way really we saw before, but they're very focused on the market opportunity and the products that will do well in that market. And the result of this kind of maturing market we're seeing in the West is that we're seeing, a squeezed middle. So that's not very, it doesn't look a very squeezed middle, but the squeezed middle of developers is having these big kind of flops now. So a few games we could have put a lot more in there, but Glue's done a lot of celebrity games. So Katy Perry Pop was one of them. Pretty much disasters, has to be said. Marvel Avenger Alliance 2, so that's obviously a sequel to a quite successful game from Disney that kind of really died quite quickly, even though it was quite polished. Star Wars Uprising, that was one of Kabam's big hopes, obviously, when the first Star Wars game reboot film came out. Total flop. That's been shut down. Again, Minions Paradise, an EA game. A brand that was big, a brand that had worked on mobile games before, and those games were, just proved that you could have big licenses. Even doing sequels to successful games. Not that the games in and of themselves were bad, but just the market conditions meant that you didn't even, get a little bit of revenue really. You got nothing if you don't connect with an audience. It is a flop time. The games on the right could maybe still be resurrected. You wouldn't necessarily say they're dead in the water now. Dawn of Titans from Zynga. That's been in soft launch. That was in soft launch for a number of years, being tested and honed. Came out, it's done okay, but it's not in the top 100 top grossing. Zynga say they can make that happen, but we'll wait and see. Against New Orleans, so that was kind of part of the reboot of Gameloft under Vivendi. Very big open world GTA type game, technically quite interesting, but hasn't really found an audience at all, and hard to see that one resurrecting itself. Now, Transformers Forged to Fight is very interesting, just come out. It is a product from Kabam, the bit that the Korean company Netmarble acquired for $750 million. Transformers is a big brand. There's a big film coming out, Transformers film, but that game, at least to date, has not done very well at all. Not in the top 100 grossing. There's again still time to turn that one around, but a hard thing to do. Super Mario Run, I mean, that's a bit arguable, I suppose, different type of model, but one of the biggest game IPs in the world comes to mobile. Nintendo uses this kind of crazy model where you get some levels for free, then you spend $10 unlocking the rest of the game. It's not done nothing. It's generated $50 million revenue probably, but Nintendo are disappointed. Nintendo thought they would get a better conversion rate than the kind of sub 5% that they got. A big IP, but the business model was wrong, and the audience said no, we're not very interested. So a difficult time really for a lot for the companies that aren't really at the top. Going back to a bit of art, here's some Damon Hirst. So the kind of a conceptual artist, kind of installation artist. In many ways, this is one of his famous Shark in a Tank, or actually probably known as the physical impossibility of death in the mind of a living being. Pompous, slightly conceptual, and this is kind of maybe in this kind of free-to-play world where we are now. Some people, think this isn't art and rather terrible, and some people think it's kind of in its own way quite beautiful. Okay, so we get to where are we going? So this is the kind of whole point of the talk in a sense, but you need the kind of context in order to kind of understand this, I believe. So where are we going? Well, let's first say where we're not going. So over the years, there's been kind of attempts to make this mobile gaming about hardcore gaming and have these kind of physical controls, and clearly that's not happening now. There's never been really much interest in them. I mean, I've got some of these devices, and the games you want to play using a joystick controller don't support it, and the ones that do aren't very good. Obviously, Nintendo Switch has come in and maybe kind of taken this concept away from mobile games, but even without Switch, I don't think it ever had much legs. Wearables, not just the Apple Watch, wearables in general were once seen as a big thing for mobile gaming. Some interesting experiments. This is Rune Blade, one of the first games to launch on the Apple Watch. Shows some interesting engagement figures, but there's no business behind it, and I think we can, in a more general sense, say wearables have not taken off as a mass market consumer item. may still happen in some way, I suppose, but it's more likely to happen about about kind of fitness and health and those kind of issues rather than it being a kind of true gaming platform. So tablets, tablets in and of themselves, people do use them to play games. I use them to play games certainly, but certain types of games you can't really play on tablets, so difficult to play portrait games on tablets. Tablets are just too big, and as we kind of have seen and will continue to see, that some of the biggest games are now use portrait modes. They're designed to be played on phones, not tablets. Kind of in another way, the type of games people wanted to play on tablets is more kind of like, is the tablet the console of a type of console. I don't think that's really been justified. There's not really been games that use these very kind of in-depth graphics and you need the big screens on. Games are not going in that way. And also this game actually on there is Vainglory. So Vainglory was a mobile MOBA. What is a mobile MOBA? And is being touted maybe as one of the first mobile esport games. So esports is very big, as we can see, but equally I think mobile esports is not going to happen. So this is the March 2017 figures for Twitch. So what games are being watched on Twitch. So again, no surprises in a sense. League of Legends #1, Counter-Strike #2, Dota 2, Hearthstone, StarCraft top 5. These are big PC console games. Hearthstone, yeah, is on mobile, but it's there because it's a PC game. We don't see any mobile games in the top 10 here. There's lots of people watching esports on their mobile devices, people watching Twitch on mobile, but I think if a mobile game was going to become an esport, we start to see it already, and I don't think we have seen anything substantial. And for me, that kind of suggests that mobile esports is unlikely to take off. And more in general, that esports itself, I mean, it's another talk but esports itself, there's a lot of hype about it, but it's very unclear where the money comes from, where the money goes, and certainly who generates profit off that, and that you need profit for it to become sustainable. So we'll see with esports more in general, but I think hard for mobile games to make much of an impact there. Mobile VR. So at one point there was kind of a strong idea that mobile VR would be the first kind of VR area to take off. We have Samsung's Gear VR, sold 5 million units. Not quite clear how many of those are active on a weekly or monthly basis. But I think over time we've not seen any kind of takeoff. We've not seen any kind of very strong games come out. We've not seen a lot of engagement, people talking excitedly about mobile VR. Partly that's because I think it seems odd for people to take their phones and kind of plug them into some other peripheral. That's not how people use their phones. And there's still this underlying thing that people, you just look stupid wearing it on your head. If you're wearing it on your head, you can't be very sociable because you're kind of locked into your little world, your VR world. So there's definitely some very powerful potential there, but it's hard to see on a social basis how VR is going to take off. And it's hard to see how mobile is a part of that. I will say though that because the potential is so important, that this could change. So not that long ago, well, it's a 1946 advert. More doctors smoke Camel than any other cigarette. Seems slightly tragic now. If it wasn't cigarettes, maybe it'd be laughable that doctors were being used to sell cigarettes that clearly kill people. But more recently, what have we seen? We've seen vaping come in and really, totally disrupt the tobacco industry, and certainly totally disrupt the way people view smoking and the way people stop smoking. So, vaping has come in, and within the period of time that's been around, has done more for public health than any of the government kind of warnings. Not that the government warnings were wrong, but they were working on a different model. They were trying to persuade people that this kind of habit they had was bad and evil, shouldn't be doing it. Vaping just said continue your habit, and you just won't be as unhealthy. So definitely something will happen around kind of VR, AR, more likely AR, I suppose. Google Glass wasn't that product, but you could see how a Google Glass type approach is less restrictive. Obviously, there's privacy issues around it as well, but you kind of think that's where kind of future vision hardware will go. Is that mobile hardware though? No, that's not mobile hardware. That's another thing entirely. So don't see mobile really as part of that. So where are we? This is where we are. So we have these billion-dollar games. So these are games that either have generated $1 billion in lifetime revenue or generate $1 billion annually, some of these. So every year for the last 5, we've seen games released that have gone on to do this. This year we'll definitely see that. I mean, it's just part of the structure of the industry, how big the industry is, that this will happen. No, I've not put any games from any Chinese games. That's partly because I don't have good data on there. There are definitely games in China that have generated $1 billion revenue, but I don't have good enough sufficient data to put them in, so I've focused on these Western games. So that's kind of where we are at the top end. And what are these games? So these are all the games we kind of mentioned, listed before then, in kind of a vague chronological order. So we have most of them, we said before, portrait mode. That's how people use their phones now. People, I think, don't think they're doing mobile gaming. They're just doing mobile entertainment. So they're using their phones in the same way they used to text or look at websites or whatever. That's how gaming works. And we've kind of boiled down to some sufficient genres. So we looked at various genres over the course of this talk, but now we kind of boiled down to a few that just do very well. Which is not to say you can't do other genres, but these are the ones that do very well. So there's strategy, there's RPG, there's match 3, there's kind of this 4X kind of idea for the Game of War type game. We have obviously mashup, so we have Puzzle and Dragons is RPG and match 3. And then we have kind of Supercell coming out with its own weird hybridization. So we have like a MOBA with card collection mechanics. Card collection mechanics used lots of places now, more for monetization. And then we have Pokemon Go, which is its own strange, beautiful thing. There's still opportunity for strange, beautiful things, certainly. But this kind of what we looked at before, this kind of flops. And it just kind of means where the industry is going now is kind of in the future is really going to be where it has been for the last couple of years. It's hard to see any big disruption happening, and partly because the big companies at the top have been so successful. Why are they going to suddenly become less successful? Are they going to lose their advantages? Is someone going to come and outcompete them at one of the things they're very good at? Obviously, could happen, but I think it's fairly unlikely. If you're the little chap in this photo, you don't want to be taking on the big chap at sumo wrestling. You maybe want to think about, well, is he any good at chess or something, or could you have a tiggling practice? You have to think about where you can be strong, where the other guys aren't strong. Which is not to say companies aren't looking to compete with the big guys. So there are plenty of companies doing it. So in terms of like 4X games, there's Polarium, there's Elex, there's FunPlus. Scopely have actually Breaking Bad a game in soft launch for this kind of 4X thing. They're trying to compete with MZ. Now, these companies aren't unsuccessful companies, but they're just trying to compete with a very successful company, which makes it very difficult. On the left, we have companies trying to compete with King and Match 3 Games. So Jam City, US company hoping to IPO. Peak Games, Playrex is the big surprise story really the last couple of years with its Match 3 kind of stuff. Scopely again did a WWE kind of a hybrid Match 3 game. So these people are not necessarily unsuccessful, but they've chosen to play in a very competitive market against very big companies with very deep pockets. So hard. So what's everyone else doing? Well, it's all about really if you have a game in the market, how can you make the best use of that? So it's very hard to launch games now, very hard to launch games high into the charts. There's just so much competition for players and payers. So it's much more about if you have a game already that's doing well in the charts, or even not doing so well in the charts, how can you focus on making that game be better? So we kind of have this idea now that operations trumps creativity, not that creativity is unimportant, but operation comes first. So live operations in particular here, we see EA talking about live services, Glue talking about its evergreen games, Zynga forever franchises. Even though it's looking at doing new games, so MZ is working with Square Enix on Final Fantasy 15, a new Empire. I mean, that's basically a reskin of its other 4X games. Activision's doing a 4X game, Call of Duty, with Elex, that company we looked at, Chinese company. King maybe doing something a little bit different, but it's doing a Call of Duty, an IP-based shooter, which may or may not come out. Social Casino. So we're seeing not really a lot of massive creativity, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's just the way the market is. And let's have a quick look at two companies here who we've mentioned a little bit in the past. So here's Pocket Gems, successful US publisher, developer. In the early days of free-to-play, it published these kind of like Tappy, Petty, Paradisey, Zooey kind of games, and was fairly successful. But over the years, it's really honed its offerings to basically 2 at the moment. It has other games in development, but 2 games that have been very successful. So on the far right, we have episodes. So this is partly user-generated, but kind of interactive narrative games, kind of for a more female audience. Some of them are young, kind of skew younger. So not a terribly different audience to what it had originally with its tap games, but a very different type of game, a more less gamey type of game. But its other big successful game is War Dragon. So that's what might call a mid-core kind of has building elements, has action elements where you're flying these dragons around to destroy other people's bases. You're leveling up your dragons, breeding them, that kind of stuff. So even a bit of Dragon Veil in there. Pocket Games has really spent a lot of time and money focusing on a small amount of products to get to where it is now. Glue Mobile, a bit more kind of accidental, maybe a bit more not quite sure where it's going. So anyway, it started out with lots of shooter games with zombies, guns, this kind of stuff, snipers. Its biggest game is Kim Kardashian, so done $180 million of revenue, but have been big issues about the royalty payments, particularly for a lot of the celebrity games it did off the back of Kim Kardashian. That didn't work. But its biggest game at the moment is Design Home. So again, is this really a game? It's an interactive interior design kind of experience, and the big thing is you vote on other people's kind of layout. So you have this kind of light social, it's not really PvP in a way, but in another way it is. So Glue has really been transformed by the market from this kind of hardcore 3D games company for guys, teenage boys at least, to this kind of more female kind of embrace company, and an older kind of skew of female players. So interesting to see whether Glue can pull that off and survive with those kind of new models. So where does it leave the rest of us? Well, yes, you can still thrive, but I think you have to be very careful and think about how you're doing that. So this is a photo of the Falkland Islands. So this is a minefield, 35 years old. And the mines are there, people don't go there. The penguins are not heavy enough to set off the mine, so the penguins have been thriving and the people have kept out. So you can definitely be a penguin. You can think about what are the big guys not doing, what am I really passionate about, and particularly I guess from a business point of view, thinking about your cost structure. How much, what is a big hit? What does that mean for you? Is $1 billion? $1 billion is a lot of money, but you need a lot of people to create these $1 billion games. You need hundreds of people. So if you're a little company, a couple of guys, a couple of people, what is success for you? Is a paid game selling 100,000 units? Is that success for you? Can you build a business on that basis? There's thinking about that, thinking obviously about mobile devices and what works for them. This is a prime example of Us2's Monument Valley. So absolutely beautiful paid puzzle game that just everyone loved playing it. Everyone would. Well, I say everyone. I mean, it did $15 million revenue. So for some people that seems like a lot. For some people that seems like not very much at all. If you're doing a paid game, you won't. This is the upper limit really. If you do a paid game, you're doing $1 million revenue. You're doing very, very well. But these guys really took a risk and did something extraordinary, and this mobile still provides those opportunities. So the thing about the mobile games industry is always new games come along, always new opportunities. So here we just see kind of a very quick examples of those. So we have kind of indie hits, in this case kind of Papers, Please, which is kind of highlighting social issues, immigration. There's always opportunities for that, and that's a game that's just not on mobile. It's a game on kind of a PC, Steam, and other platforms. So you have that kind of approach where you can use mobile as part of a kind of multi-channel distribution. We have idle games. That's a big thing over the last couple of years. We have Chuck Norris, non-stop Chuck Norris there. Idle games are really beautifully made for mobile. There's very little interaction, quite a lot of meta game leveling up, so you don't really control Chuck Norris at all in this game. Chuck Norris goes away and beats guys up, and you can just kind of have a look, see what's going on, and often there's something to do, like some leveling up, or there's a boss guy to beat. There are kind of buttons at the bottom of the screen that you can kind of press to kind of speed up the action, but you're not really in control. So it's a very kind of mobile friendly type of genre, which is why it's got so big. We have kind of new mashups, new kind of really smooth user experience situations. So that game next to it is Cats, which is Crash Arena Turbo Stars. So that's from Zeptolab. So we looked at Zeptolab earlier in the game with Cut the Rope. And they've been kind of plugging away. We've had a few interesting games that didn't quite work out. This one is the new one, doing really well. And it's a kind of a PvP. You're building these kind of combat vehicles. You're leveling up the different components. You're not in control of them, so you put them into arena. The physics and the AI just kind of take over, and one wins, one loses. And so it's kind of has this nice kind of PvP kind of leveling up meta game and a leaderboard experience. But you're not in this game for hours. You're kind of in and out, just kind of leveling up, and always, again, like the idle games, always something to do. And the game's actually doing really well in terms of monetizing. So it's a top 30 top grossing game in the US at the moment. Above that we have Agar.io, so kind of a web game that got very big on mobile, particularly off the back of YouTube's YouTubing Let's Plays, that kind of stuff. Just a very kind of simple game in terms of the actual gameplay. Strong kind of social elements around it. Harder to monetize those games, but these are kind of new types of genres. These are new types of experiences that you're not trying to compete with a Supercell or an MZ. But these opportunities will always be arising in mobile. And it's kind of, you can't really have a business talk without a Wayne Gretzky quote, can you? Particularly this Wayne Gretzky quote, which is so good. I skate to where the puck is going to be. And that's kind of what we're looking at now. We're in this kind of mixing our metaphors. We're in this minefield that there's these big players and there's some smaller players trying to compete with the big players when it comes to the very kind of obvious genres. Hard to make headway in those genres, in those particular markets. So let's look at where the niches are. Let's look where the puck's going to be. So we're looking at kind of, PvP is very big. Social elements. The PvP is part of that. Social elements very big. User generated content can be big in certain games. You probably can always push on that. And different ways of kind of mashing up kind of social interaction. And always new opportunities, I think, for gameplay and taking advantage of the great reach of mobile games, but always thinking about the mobile device itself. How does that game really fulfill that kind of portrait mode where people are playing now, and how to fulfill that kind of just dipping in. You're not really playing these games for an hour at a time, but you may over the course of a day dip in for 10 minutes or 10 times or 5 minutes, 20 times. That's where the opportunity always arises and will always arise for mobile. But in terms of big changes, I think over the next couple of years, we're not seeing any big disruptive changes. We're kind of seeing just kind of a maturing market, even with kind of strong growth in Asia. So let's end with a classic kind of art here. So here's Van Gogh, so Wheatfield and Cypress trees. Where have we come to in mobile games? We've seen a lot of kind of history. A lot of things have changed. We're perhaps not in an environment that is kind of realistic. This is not a photograph, clearly. There's a different view on the world with mobile games where we've kind of ended up. It's not where we maybe thought we were at the beginning. But a little bit scary, maybe a little bit oppressive at times. Certainly different kind of skills required to be successful, but still a thing with opportunity and beauty. So thanks for listening to the talk. You can contact me, Jon, at accidentalgizmo.com. You can follow some of the things I do about free-to-play mobile games, on Twitter at The Long View, and also at YouTube, The Long View as well. So don't forget to put any comments. I'm always interested to read your comments. Hi, and thanks for watching right to the end of the video. We always like to see your comments, so please put them in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe. And check out some more of our other videos about the mobile games industry. There's 2 really good examples on your screen right now.